Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of 2023. My name is Agata Ostaszewska, and I'm the Embracing Complexity lead. I'm really excited for this webinar, for which our speakers will explore neurodevelopmental research beyond diagnostic categories. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of Embracing Complexity, I'll just give you a brief introduction. Embracing Complexity is a coalition of 61 organizations working together to improve the lives of neurodivergent people. The current issue is that diagnosis is often a requirement to receive adequate support. However, neurodivergent people are waiting too long for initial diagnosis, and people often have more than one condition. However, self-help services do not adequately recognize or plan for the high likelihood of multiple neurodevelopmental diagnoses. Diagnostic categories don't reflect real-life experience of neurodivergent people who may not fit into a diagnostic box. Navigating the system to get diagnosis can be very difficult, and as a consequence, people often don't receive the support they need. Since our launch in May 2019, Embracing Complexity have been calling for a more joined-up approach, acknowledging the overlap of neurodevelopmental conditions. Our focus for next 3 years is to work closely with the community of neurodivergent people and design and conduct research that will allow us to explore how to drive changes across public services and all parts of society to overcome societal barriers that prevent neurodivergent people from living the life they desire and accessing equal opportunities. Embracing Complexity is chaired by Autistica and funded by Waterloo Foundation. For this webinar, I am very pleased to welcome our three speakers, Dr. Blandine French, Dr. Silvana Mareva, and Professor Amanda Kirby. Blandine will be talking about the pros and cons of using distinct neurodiversity labels in research and how we can look at neurodiversity as an umbrella term. Silvana will focus on the shortcomings of diagnostic frameworks and considering how transdiagnostic models might be useful in research and practice. Amanda will be talking about the combination of neurodiversity and adversity and why people get misdiagnosed and misunderstood. I am very excited to welcome our first speaker. Blandine, over to you.
Thank you, Agata. So today I'm going to talk to you about researching neurodevelopmental disorders. Just for a bit of background, so I work at the University of Nottingham as a researcher, and I've done quite a lot of research on dyspraxia, mainly ADHD, and a little bit on autism as well. And when I was trying to prepare for this presentation, I think I would like to disclose that, none of this is about, opinion. I'm just going to try to share a shared view about the problems around either focusing on neurodevelopmental conditions as a whole or just focusing on different labels. And there's pros and cons in either, I think. And also, this doesn't come from a clinical aspect. My views on whether we need to use neurodevelopmental conditions as a whole when it comes to diagnosis and pathway to care are very, very different. But I just try to focus on the research aspect of this. So let me try to share my slides. So we know that there's a lot of overlap between all the different neurodiversities. And despite that, it's very hard to look at different conditions together when we do research, even though my expertise in ADHD and I have done work with dyspraxia, ODCD, and autism. When you try to look at them together and try to forget about the labels, it can become very problematic from a research point of view. And in order to focus my career and to focus my research, I've had to find an expert topic. I mean, maybe it is possible to have a career in research and look at neurodiversity as a whole. I'm yet to find someone that has done that, straight from out of a PhD. So I kind of had to focus on ADHD. And yes, I just wanted to talk about the different issues going either way from what I can see and from what I've experienced. And I think my take-home message that put out straight away is that it's just not black and white. I don't think there's yet a way that is either right or wrong. So when it comes to the dilemmas of research with around label is that the way that research works at the moment is separated with the different topics, and that comes with when it comes to publications. So the journals that publish research are focused just on ADHD, just on autism, just on depression, or very specific conditions. And I wouldn't know what you will do. Yeah, it just becomes. It's the same with conferences, for example. Conferences as well. There is the ADHD World Congress. There is other conferences for very specific disorders. Is the same for funders. So you can apply for different funds depending on what kind of conditions you have. And it's the same for research staff. So I'm finding that a lot of the neurodiversity research is kind of siloed into this very specific topic, with depending on if you research autism or ADHD or dyspraxia, and it's really hard to break away from that. And for example, with the staff, you have your autistic experts and your ADHD experts, and then they rarely branch out to look at other conditions. So if you wanted to look at neurodiversity as a whole, you will have a lot of barriers to go through in terms of getting funding, in terms of where to present your research, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that it's not possible. It just means that it's quite difficult. And also, if we wanted to look at neurodiversity as a whole, the quality and quantity of research in differ widely across different disorders. So there are neurodiversities that are looked at more than others. There are neurodiversities that have been invested in more than others, that have more interest than others, which means that trying to look at it equally is nigh on impossible. And I was just looking at this slide that I took from Louise Arsenault from one of her presentations about how research money has been spent from the MQ report. And if you look, for example, we just focus on this is about mental health, but if you focus on neurodiversities, you can see that 5.2% of the millions of pounds that is spent on research go to autism, and 4% go towards all the other neurodiversity, which means that some conditions get a lot less funding, get a lot less attention, and therefore the quality and the amount of research that we have is just not the same. So, for example, when I first met Amanda, I was working on a project on dyspraxia, looking at the neural correlates, fMRI studies, and looking at the brain correlations with dyspraxia. And at the time, I mean, we're talking a few years back, 5, 6 years ago, 7 maybe, there were only you could count on 2 hands how many people had looked at dyspraxia and the brain correlates. This has gone a bit better over the last 7, 8 years, but if you look at the brain correlates of autism, there is a lot more studies around that. So I guess my point is that if you were to try to look at to get rid of the labels, just from a research point of view, it would just not be equal, and it would just be very difficult to kind of group them together the way the research is at the moment. But then if you were to look at, if you were to look at neurodiversity as a whole as well, I mean, that's one of the positives of using labels, I think. Well, I don't know if it's positive, but it's very, very hard to think, what do you include? Let's take research, neurodiversity as a whole. And from now on, I'm not going to do autism research. I'm not going to do ADHD research. I'm going to do neurodiversity research. What do you include? There's still a lot of debate about what is a neurodiversity, what is a neurodevelopmental condition, what isn't. Although a lot of the conditions are similar, it is very hard to step away from the label and to know exactly what's what. Now, I think from a clinical point of view, I'm on the opinion that it doesn't matter what's what. It doesn't matter if, my struggles are from my ADHD or my autism. What matters is I can at least get help. But from a research point of view, if you're trying to understand more scientific facts about certain conditions so we can help people, it is helpful also to look at it at specific labels and to say, well, you know, the ADHD brains work like that, and because the ADHD brains work like that, this is how we can help it. And therefore, the cause and effect of what conditions do what, and how we can treat them, how we can improve them, and what it means is blurred if we just don't give those labels. And I think it will, I mean, for me, the main point as well is that we need to change the whole system. We could change the way we look at research for neurodiversity, and we could try to embrace that and look at it as a, you know, umbrella term. Let's just not give those labels. But while the clinical aspects look at labels, and while, you know, services and pathway to care and, you know, still silos these terms separately, it would just be, well, I just think it would be very hard to do research not following that system. So for me, we need a whole system change. And then it will trickle down to the research, maybe to the research funding, maybe to the research conferences. You know, I mean, there are more conferences looking at neurodiversity, but it will mean a whole new change. And yes, I guess I don't know how useful this presentation is, but I don't think I have any answers. I have been debating a lot about, I would like to call myself a neurodiversity researcher rather than an ADHD researcher, but I've found many barriers in doing that. So for example, in the project I'm currently working on, I'm looking at the cost of undiagnosed autism and ADHD. I wanted to look at the cost of undiagnosed neurodiversity, but I wasn't allowed by the funder. I was forced to kind of narrow it down to specific topics because I thought it was too vague, because of all the reasons I explained. I thought that there wouldn't be enough data for certain neurodiversity. And actually, this is what I'm finding, that there's a lot of data, for example, with the risk associated with ADHD and autism, but there isn't that many with Tourette's or with, you know, dyspraxia, for example. So we wouldn't be able to make generic conclusions. And I get that, I understand that point. But I don't really know what the answer is, and how we could just move forward and stop those bias that are created by a very specific label, and what that will look like in the research world. So maybe this presentation just raises a lot more questions than answer, but just wanted to introduce where I was at and what it meant in trying to implement this neurodiversity umbrella term into a research context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blandine, for the very good introduction into the topic and some of the challenges that we experience as researchers looking in this space. I'm just going to share my slides. My name is Silvana. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you today. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I think it's a very important topic. And yeah, like I said, thank you, Blandine, for the introduction. What I chose to focus on today was one example of an attempt to do a transdiagnostic study. And before I do that, I'll just kind of like quickly outline some of the things that Blandine already mentioned and some of the challenges of sort of traditional approach, what it looks like, and why we may want to do a transdiagnostic study in the first place. So historically, neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories have been understood in terms of core deficits. Theories of core deficits are largely based on a very medical model of understanding conditions and kind of attempt to implicate a single explanatory root as a cause behind, let's say, ADHD and dyslexia. And the idea here being that perhaps there is a cognitive, neurological, or genetic cause that gives rise to a profile that then diagnostic manuals would recognize as ADHD. A prominent example is the executive dysfunction theory of ADHD, which suggests that symptoms of ADHD arise fully as a result of difficulties with executive or attentional control. So perhaps then this idea is translated into the kind of research study that we do. And this means that typically what we would do, we would recruit a group of typically developing children and ADHD children, and then we would choose the kind of assessments that we would do within the study based on that. We would be looking at a core deficit for the group, such as executive functioning for ADHD, and then we would be analyzing the data by comparing the groups, aiming to kind of establish how one group might be different from the other. But there's several key limitations to this approach. So first of all, it sort of assumes that everybody within a diagnostic group is somehow fundamentally similar, that the people with the same diagnostic category have the same experiences or challenges that are caused by this core deficit, which actually stands in contrast with a lot of evidence that we know of not everybody who for example, is diagnosed with ADHD having the same experience. And in fact, there is quite a substantial evidence that not everybody diagnosed with ADHD experiences executive function difficulties even. And secondly, there is this kind of issue around overlap of the experiences of individuals with distinct diagnoses, which this kind of like traditional type of research often masks or kind of misses out on. And then finally, there is an issue around representation. So individuals who don't fit diagnostic criteria, they're often overlooked and tend to be not represented in research studies. So to kind of acknowledging all of these limitations, many have called for a shift towards transdiagnostic framework in which this kind of categorical boundaries as dictated by diagnostic manuals are relaxed. So the so-called transdiagnostic studies, they would change multiple ingredients within the traditional research design. So starting, for example, from the very samples that they would study. So they may recruit a diverse group of individuals. This can be individuals who are diagnosed with different conditions, let's say, or it could be based on needs. It could be what I've called here functional recruitment. This includes everybody who identifies as neurodivergent, for example, or everyone who their family or their school, for example, have identified them as experiencing neurodevelopmental difficulties, let's say, regardless of whether they meet diagnostic criteria or regardless whether they've undergone a diagnostic assessment. So once this kind of like broad sample is identified, then the next ingredient in a transdiagnostic study is a set of measures or assessments that you may want to choose to focus on. So transdiagnostic studies here, they aim to focus on a broad variety of measures that relate to functioning rather than to just looking at core deficits. And finally, the key ingredient is a change in the kind of analysis what we may do. If this group membership is loosened, then we need to think about new methods that go beyond the conventional group comparison. And we may need to look at data-driven methods that are commonly applied in this space, that is capturing dimensions or hierarchies of traits or characteristics. Or we may look at the network of how specific interrelationships emerge across these traits or experiences. Or we may want to identify individuals who have similar strengths and weaknesses across kind of this domains or traits. But broadly speaking, the idea in a transdiagnostic study is that we shift the emphasis to capture the functioning of their individual regardless of their formal label. So the example that I'm going to talk to you about today is one of the first studies that kind of attempted to do this, at least to my knowledge, in the neurodevelopmental space. And this is a research clinic called Center for Attention, Learning and Memory. It's based in Cambridge, where I've worked for 5 years. What this study aimed to do, it makes to kind of like adopt this more inclusive or needs-based rather than diagnosis-based recruitment strategies that I just mentioned. In other words, children who experience neurodevelopmental difficulties as identified by health and educational professionals were sampled regardless of whether their needs met diagnostic thresholds or not. And this recruitment resulted in a cohort of over 800 children. 60% of them had a diagnosis at the point when they came to the center, and you kind of see the breakdown of the people who referred the children to the study. And in addition, we also recruited 200 children who weren't referred to us, meaning they weren't identified by practitioners as struggling, but instead they just were drawn from the same schools that were attended by the children who were referred to us. And then what we did, well, we kind of used this like very broad protocol, included all sorts of assessments related to neurodevelopmental difficulties. We had neuropsychological batteries, we had assessments of academic skills, mental health, as well as kind of brain imaging, looking at brain function, brain structure, and we also collected saliva samples to look at like the genetic side of things. I don't have time today to kind of go over all of the different things that we had done with this cohort and all of the attempts we made to design transdiagnostic studies and to ask transdiagnostic questions. What I'll do, I'll just focus on one quick example of the kind of study that one may do with this data set. And the example that I'm going to focus on today had a specific question in mind, which was around behavior, language, and social communication. That was kind of the focus. And the reason why we chose to focus on this kind of domains for this study was because behavioral and language difficulties are incredibly common in neurodevelopmental conditions. For example, hyperactivity and inattention are among the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Social communication is among diagnostic criteria for autism. Structural language difficulties, very much the hallmark of developmental language disorder. But while this kind of domains are typically studied in the conditions in which they're considered to be characteristic, there is actually quite a lot of overlap in this space. So while they're often studied separately, there is actually a comorbidity that's estimated to be between 57 and 81%, meaning that a lot of children who present with emotional behavioral conditions also have significant language needs, and the other way around. Children who do have language needs, also when you look at their profile at an emotional and behavioral level, they also have unmet behavioral and emotional needs. So what we did in this case, we wanted to focus on our diverse transdiagnostic sample, and we wanted to ask if we can identify children with similar profiles of strengths and difficulties across these domains, because we had a feeling that these domains sort of do not occur in isolation and they may actually operate across diagnostic boundaries. And we wanted to see whether we can identify these children with similar profiles and whether the profiles the children have across these domains would correspond to diagnosis, mental health, academic functioning, and neural white matter organization. And why we may want to do that? Well, the reason we looked at this question was because we wanted to ask whether individual differences in these domains can drive clusters or subgroups of individuals who share similar profiles. And we kind of reasoned that if we can do that, perhaps this would help us understand common pathways to specific difficulties and may enable us to choose appropriate support strategies for their needs. And what I'm doing here, I'm just kind of illustrating this kind of analysis across two dimensions. If we were to imagine, for example, this was a dimension capturing inattention, and this was another dimension capturing social communication, we would see that the individuals who kind of are here represented by the dotted lines, they tend to be the ones that are high on one dimension but low on the other one. And we may assume that their profile is quite different from the individuals who are over here, let's say, where they tend to be high on both social communication difficulties and inattention. So kind of help taking that logic to kind of try to map out strengths and difficulties and see what profiles emerge. But in our case, this is kind of an example with only two traits. In our case, we were looking at a broader space. So we were looking at specifically what we looked at structural language, by which I mean kind of the more formal aspects of language related to the use of grammar, speech, that sort of thing. We looked at social communication, cognitive regulation skills, which have to do with like memory and attention and more emotional regulation type of difficulties as well. And what we did, we had this questionnaire data, parent ratings across these domains. And we looked at how similar each one of those 800 children in our cohort were to one another. And we represented that as a network. So in our network, each one of these little nodes was a child. And if two children were kind of similar to one another across all of these domains in which we were studying, then we draw edges between them. And kind of this is the kind of network that resulted in the end. And then we use the statistical algorithms that can tell us which children are more similar to one another compared to others. And what this statistical technique allowed us to see was that there were three profiles represented in this sample, which here are represented in green, in yellow, and in red. And then I'm going to show you how these three profiles were doing across the domains of interest compared to the non-referred children. So what we see here are structural language, social communication, cognitive regulation, and emotional or affective regulation. We have labeled it here. In blue, we see our non-referred group. And what we can see, first of all, is that relative to the non-referred group, all of our profiles that we identified, they were experiencing substantial levels of difficulties. But there was a specificity here as well, in the sense that the group in yellow was the group that kind of their primary difficulties were in the areas of structural language. For our group represented in green, we see that their difficulties were primarily in this kind of cognitive regulation domain. And for the group that is represented in red, their problems were more pronounced in the social communication or emotional regulation domain. So we're seeing three groups with different kind of strengths and weaknesses. So the next question here is, do these profiles of strengths and difficulties across domains, do they correspond to diagnostic labels? What did we see? Well, we saw that in this example, I'm focusing on autism and ADHD just for the sake of time, but we've done this analysis with other groups as well, and we kind of always came to the same conclusion. In the case of ADHD and autism, children with this diagnosis were represented in each one of these profiles, but both groups were overrepresented in the same group. In this case, this was the red group that was characterized by difficulties with social communication and emotional regulation. But still, 40 or more % of the children with this diagnosis were not included in the group, meaning that they had more pronounced difficulties with language or cognitive or in the cognitive regulation domain, showing us that diagnostic labels didn't clearly correspond to this kind of data-driven profiles of strengths and difficulties. Then when we looked at how children were doing at school, what we saw, again, relative to our comparison sample, children, all of these groups had difficulties in these domains, but it was the children in the yellow and red and green group that experienced more difficulties on kind of reading and math assessments administered in the lab relative to the red group. But the other way around, when you look at how children are doing in the more kind of social emotional domain, this time the children that were in our red group were the ones that were having the more pronounced difficulties. And then looking at the neural level, what we saw, I'm not going to get into details, but broadly, when we looked at neural white matter organization, we found that most of the differences we saw relative to the comparison sample were common to all groups. These are the dark blue areas in the figure here. In other words, we found that our groups had altered neural white matter connectivity in many of the same areas. We also found a few profile unique patterns that relative to the comparison sample, but these didn't correspond to diagnosis. These corresponded to the primary areas of difficulties that we identified for each group, suggesting that break organization corresponds to functional skills and not diagnostic labels. So kind of just to conclude at the end, we identified different profiles of strengths and difficulties, but we saw that they related to similar academic and social emotional profiles, overall representing alternative but related developmental pathways to difficulties in these areas. We saw that diagnostic labels did not clearly map to primary difficulties, and underscoring this, we think that we need to understand neurodevelopment without being so bound by diagnostic categories, and we need to think about support strategies that are centered on the person and their functioning and their needs and not their diagnostic label. And finally, we saw that most brain features that play a role in neurodevelopment are general, not specific to diagnosis. Brain organization tends to be related to functional skills and not diagnostic labels. I'm not going to get into kind of the rest of the slides for the sake of time, but broadly, we've asked this question across multiple levels. We have seen that this kind of groupings of children based on their behavior, based on their brain, or based on the way that they do neuropsychological assessments. None of this kind of things really maps on well to diagnostic labels overall, because neurodevelopmental conditions are very diverse. They often co-occur and are explained by multiple causes, which stands in contrast to a lot of the theories that specify core deficits as roots to specific diagnosis. I'm going to skip over the rest of the slides, but I think these are just some useful questions to reflect on in terms of these findings and how they link to our infrastructure, both medically, legally, and our educational system, and thinking about what might be the ways forward. I'm just going to close by saying that if you're interested to know more about this project, please visit the CAM website. There's lots of resources out there, lots of papers that have been published, and the data is soon going to be released and to be available to any researcher interested to ask questions with this data set. And with that, I just want to say a big thank you to the wonderful team that is behind this study, with a big thank you to the people in the pictures here, Professor Sue Gathercole, Professor Johnny Holmes, and Professor Duncan Aspel, who have been instrumental in setting up this study. And yeah, I think we're saving questions for the end, but thank you for now.
So I'm Amanda Kirby. I'm a professor in the field of neurodevelopmental disorders. I've been around for a long time and struggled to fit into I think I'm an oddball because I started working in transdiagnostic ways of working 25, 30 years ago, and felt at the time that when I was seeing children and adults clinically, that they didn't fit into the neat diagnostic frameworks that often were present. What we know, and thank you, Silvana and Blandine, particularly for your presentations, and Silvana, your ending one was really pertinent. I think what we know today is, and from your work and from others as well, is that co-occurrence is the rule rather than the exception, and that people moving through the system don't fit into nice, neat boxes. And the system is built, the educational system, the employment system, the justice system has been generally built in a way which is devised for the average person. And the research we've described, and I've described, I've done work over the years in the field of DCD, developmental coordination disorder, and other co-occurring conditions. Often our samples, when we were looking at them, in the early years, we were looking at a group of children or adults with ADHD, and we excluded everybody who didn't have anything else. So if you think back to our findings 20, 30 years ago, a lot of that was based on a clinical group that was really the exception rather than the rule. They weren't the children and the adults that we normally see that have a number of conditions that overlap with each other. So our selection criteria and our conclusions couldn't really be utilized in the general population, but we were doing that all the time. So we're looking in silos, ADHD alone, autism alone, DCD alone, even though we know today that individuals have co-occurrence, and we've got so much evidence to back that up. The other thing is that when we're thinking about recruiting and we're thinking about engaging people in the research that we do, the way we engage is often people who do engage in that research don't always come from across social domains. And so some of the recruitment as well didn't always reflect society. So I want to talk to you about the 3 M's, and I can start to talk about that while we're waiting for the slides. And this is missing, misdiagnosed, and misunderstood. Over the last 25 years, I've realized that if we want to have an impact with our research, and it reflects how we can help individuals who are neurodivergent in society, we need to be thinking about equitable routes. Now, we know that autism, ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, DLD, developmental language disorder, tic disorders, dyslexia, dyscalculia, often co-occur. We've got lots of evidence. We've got many papers from many researchers showing that. Yet we keep going back into our silos because we're finding it hard because we like to categorize. And if we can't clearly box people up, then we can't make sense of our data. But as Silvana said, with her research, which is really important, and with other people's research as well, and I'll show you a couple of other people's research as well as my own, is that that isn't the group that is in society. It doesn't represent the people who are neurodivergent, who are trying to access support, diagnosis, and they keep getting missed. And I think that the structure of how we're operating isn't working. So I want to show you how perhaps we need to look at the missing, misdiagnosed, and then look at why that makes sense if we're going to have an impact in society of supporting people adequately. So let me start off while we're just sorting that out. So what are the 3 M's? Missing, misunderstood, and misdiagnosed. When we're thinking about the data we're collecting, but also the individuals in society who's getting into services and getting support. Okay, so if we're thinking about what's the purpose of doing the work we're doing, and we're thinking about identifying individuals who are neurodivergent in society, what are we really trying to do if we're researchers and clinicians? So we've got a responsibility. And I like Galway's formula, performance equals potential minus interference. And what we try to think about, what is stopping people reach their full potential? Can you have the next slide, please? So systems are usually designed for the average person. And what does the mean really mean? If we're looking at and defining those statistics, and we're taking a reference point and saying, is this representative of one person with ADHD? Then actually, what does that mean? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So Gabor Mate wrote about the myth of normal, worth having a read if you want to, big bedtime reading. Our lives, what happens when life acts upon life. And I think this is really important when we're thinking about the missing, misunderstood, and the misdiagnosed. Next slide, please. So there are different doors that result in different pathways. And what we see is that not everybody's getting into clinical services or into the research because they are outside a system. Next slide, please. And the reality is that different professionals have different lenses they look through, whether it's a researcher who's doing research on ADHD or autism or dyslexia or dyscalculia, or it's a clinician or educational professional who's got one set of tools or another. What happens is we start to look through different lenses and we don't look overall. So that's why Silvana's research is really useful, to emphasize the fact of the lack of clustering that fits over diagnostic boxes. They were fitting much more into functional areas. Next slide, please. We can click on. And we go one more, please. Can you go one more? Thanks, that's lovely. So we've all got different, this is our cognitive, sorry, go back one, Agatha, I beg your pardon. If we think about our cognitive buckets and we're thinking about who gets help and support, what I think is really important if we're thinking about transdiagnostic pathways, who misses out? What happens if you're sub-threshold? Until relatively recently, we thought of a sort of dichotomous approach. Those who have it, the diagnosis, get help and support. Those who don't quite get it, it's not that they've been cured on the way there, but they are in a middle ground where actually functionally, if you add all the balls in their bucket, this left-hand bucket you can see there, who misses out? They miss out, and I'll explain who they are in a moment. Next slide, please. So very few people are just one thing. We understand about co-occurrence more and more. Next slide, please. And delays or no support can result in people going on different diagnostic pathways, some positively gaining support and intervention, but some going down, next slide, please, along a sort of quagmire of falling and slipping through the net. And we often see that some individuals, children who are neurodivergent, go from the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please. So I want us to really think very closely, and the ethical reasons for us not thinking in this way, around adversity plus neurodiversity, and the reason why some people don't get into clinical services, and why we've supported systems that like and valued people who can get to services who are neat and fix neatly into those boxes till now. So if we look at, so I'm talking about neurodiversity and adversity, and there's increasing work, published work, research in this area, looking at what happens when we look at into children who've had neurodevelopmental conditions and adverse childhood experiences. And this work, I think, is really important because it's leading the way to think about what our clinical pathways really need to look like. So Garwani and Helen Minnis's work is really show that 1 and 1 equals 3, that when you have the presence of neurodiversity and adversity together gives a greater combined impact. So this is why we have to deal with the messiness that is the reality of life. Next slide, please. So let's think about the 3 M's quickly. Misunderstood, those intergenerational adversity. So if you've had parents who have dyslexia or have autism or ADHD, maybe they haven't been diagnosed, they were missed. So maybe they don't recognize in their children that they've got those diagnostic groupings, so they don't get referred. And so we see the adversity the impact, the fallout of having neurodiversity without support. Next slide, please. And I think this slide is important in the sense of this epigenetic cumulative diversity. If we don't stop and look at what are the reasons for children and adults not getting into services, and think about diagnostic, transdiagnostic systems and ecological systems, I think we'll keep going through not identifying generation after generation. Next slide, please. So we've also got those who have come from low-income families. We know that individuals from low-income families are likely to be misunderstood and missed, and are less likely to get a diagnosis of neurodivergent traits or conditions. Next slide, please. And we see that parents often not know how to ask support. And when we're doing research or we're doing clinical work, we need to think about the accessibility. In one town I'm working with at the moment, the average age of literacy is 9 years of age. Average, and when I did a readability statistics on a form that was fill in for adults coming into an ADHD or autism service, the reading age of the documentation those people had to fill was A-level plus. So how can people engage if we don't actually provide things in an accessible form? Next slide, please. So we know that lower income families are more likely to be given a label of emotional behavioural disorder. So we've got biases in who gets one diagnosis or another. Next slide, please. And there are better or worse labels. So we see that until relatively recently, ADHD was a worse label. So there are social biases in who comes forward and whether ADHD is a good thing to talk about or not. And that frames how you do recruitment as well. Next slide, please. We also see the missed identified later are those that are brighter, capable kids that only get identified when they are not coping any longer. So some of them getting identified in universities and colleges, for instance, or into the workplace. Next slide, please. Females particularly are a missed group, and it's only till relatively recently that we're starting to identify females who have got ADHD and autism, DCD, are published in DCD, because we're masking and being able to hide or camouflage some of their traits. But a lot of the early research was focused much more on males and what males look like. So we were looking for males all the time. So we had biases in the type of our recruitment in our research as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so next slide, thanks. So we've also got misdiagnosed, and what we've seen is a recent paper from Cardiff University showing that women with ADHD were more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression, given a variety of different antidepressants, because ADHD hadn't been identified. So one of the barriers for clinical practice is raising awareness around neurodevelopmental conditions among psychiatric services as well. We've got these pockets where people fall out because of lack of awareness, but also our siloed approaches to mental health, neurodevelopmental disorders in subsets, an ADHD service, an autism service, a tic disorder service. Okay, so you can just click through those, Agatha, thanks. So we often see diagnostic overshadowing that, for instance, developmental language disorder, you get in children, there's good research showing that children get lower levels of speech and language therapy, with higher rates of challenges get lower amounts of speech and language therapy than those who have autism. So we have these biases as well. Traumatic brain injury being missed or not considered and being thought of as ADHD. Looked after children being seen it's an attachment disorder rather than considering ADHD and autism. Next slide, please. So there was a recent study really describing this study I was telling you about in Cardiff, where the women with ADHD symptoms were kept being diagnosed with recurrent depression. Next slide, please. We've got children in care. I think somebody's put in the chat about being a social worker. Absolutely. So misdiagnosed, they're moving around the system, and anybody's out of the system is much less likely to get identified. More school moves, harder to make and maintain friendships. You can keep going. Gaps in learning, and may have prior health needs. And when we look at the comparison between neurodivergent rates in children in care, they're higher than in the general population, but they're less likely to be diagnosed because we overshadow and say this is attachment rather than looking at diversity plus neurodiversity. Next slide, please. You can go on. That's the next one. So the other group that's moving around the system that are missed as well are those excluded learners. So these, again, children out of education that have been excluded, often have higher rates of neurodivergent traits, but they're less likely to be diagnosed. Next slide, please. And they're more likely to be given a diagnosis of SEBD or BESD. I'm doing a large data gathering in alternative provision at the moment, looking at the neurodiversity and adversity intersection in large numbers of children in 11 units across the UK. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we know from the research that children who are excluded from school are more likely to have neurodivergent traits, but we don't screen routinely because we're looking at behaviour, not the reasons for behaviour. Next slide, please. And we've got the prevalence rates in some of the studies. If you want to have this information, I can pass this to you afterwards to show you this. But we recognise that, say, developmental language disorder, ADHD, are much higher in excluded populations. Yet the pathways to gaining help and support, because those children on the majority have got a diagnosis of SEBD, we know in research studies that's right, but we're not getting them moving into being screened and getting into clinical services. Next slide, please. So we've got looked at, and then when you combine neurodiversity and different adversities, looked after children are more than 5 times more likely to have fixed period exclusion and nearly 1.5 times more likely to be children in need. This is why this is important, that we can no longer take these diagnostic narrow silos and say that's acceptable in a way when we've got this information. Next slide, please. And we know that children in care are more likely to get a diagnosis of SEMH, and they're less likely to get a diagnosis of autism. So our pathways are not fair, and they're biased, and we think that there are training implications. Next slide, please. So where did they go and where did they come from? So I've been doing research in a number of different areas where there are high rates of neurodevelopmental conditions and doing large data samples. And today, this has just been published this afternoon. This was a study done in prisons looking at individuals who've been in care and looking and using our functional screener to look at the neurodevelopmental profiles and looking at the impact on them and the relationship that had. And what we found was prisoners who were looked after were more likely to have been in a pupil referral unit. Remember that, looked after and excluded. And prisoners who were looked after scored more poorly on the functional screener for neurodisability and the self-report measures than the general population. So this is really important. And we've also got 2 more studies coming out, one of them showing that men, this was several thousand men being screened, so these are large data sets. Men who had ever been excluded from school were more likely to commit crime 8 years earlier than those who'd never been excluded from school. And they had higher functional neurodisabilities than in the general prison population. So I'm showing you that we can do messy research. It isn't easy to do so, but what the importance about this is thinking about impact. And I think the last slide, and then we can stop and take questions. And I've done further research and published a number of papers looking at how do we think about this from a systems perspective. And if we don't do things like thinking about the burden of neurodevelopmental disorders and collate information and look at the functional load we've got and think about the patterns and impact, I think we'll still keep dividing systems, clinical services, and thinking about research in silos when actually people are messy. And we need to be thinking more like the Silvana's approach, where we're trying to look at clusters and look at the impact. Because at the end, why are we here unless it's to try to make a difference? So I'll hand over and perhaps we'll take some questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing your insights from your work. I think very interesting points have been raised. And thank you everyone who has sent comments and questions so far. And just as a reminder, you can add them on Zoom in the Q&A function or on Facebook in the comments. And now we will begin the panel discussion. And I have some questions. I guess I got asked a couple of questions, and then we can move to the questions from the audience. So I think an interesting point maybe to start the discussion is because as you all said, the diagnostic categories have a direct impact on the research being conducted, and as a result, neurodevelopmental research conducted is often siloed into specialisms. And what do you think as researchers we can do to reframe the debate from distinct diagnostic categories and move towards a broader conceptualization of neurodevelopment, aside from promoting transdiagnostic neurodevelopmental assessments? I don't know if this question makes sense, but I guess the question is, what else can we do? Like how, for example, everything that you've presented in your presentations, how we can use these findings and where can we go apart from promoting transdiagnostic, like neurodevelopmental assessments to drive change. I don't know if it makes sense.
I don't mind starting off, which I think we've got to start thinking about cumulative adversity. So we need to be thinking about cumulative factors that are having the greatest impact, and then start to look at how does that relate to functional impairment? How does it relate to greater risk of other psychiatric comorbidity that's associated? What's the output? What's the long-term impact of having cumulative adversity? We need to be thinking about it in I think our constructs of ADHD, and you look back at DSM-4, DSM-3, DSM-2, right? And we had more diagnostic categorization, then we had more and more, then we had less and less. So we can change the categorization. The human beings put the categorization together, so human beings can change the categorization. And we know more today than we did, and so I think we need to reframe how we're categorizing, not to stop categorizing, because we need to look at risk and output and impact and understand the underlying etiology, but we're going to need to recategorize, and we need to see this as a neurodevelopmental spectrum, not in neat boxes that we thought it was.
I agree with Amanda. There's not much to add, because I think this is one of the points I was trying to make as well. In order to change the research, you need to change the whole system, though, and you need to change how you see it. It'd be fantastic if we could ever get to a point where you look at neurodiversity as a whole, and then it's based on individual differences and difficulties and strengths, and you do an assessment of what the individual looks like. I share the motivation and excitement. I'm just not too sure that in terms of practicalities, it would be great if we could redo the whole, we could create a DSM-6 when you change it. I just don't know how to get there. It just seems like such a vague and difficult end goal. I just don't know what the practicalities would be.
I think we can. I think we can. I think we have to challenge that. I'm collecting tens of thousands of data sets, right, using computerization to do so. With data analysis, we can look at the clusters and provide functional guidance live, right? Stat today, not tomorrow, today, right? So that an individual who's coming through for a diagnostic, I can give you an example. I'm doing a project at the moment where we've got long waiting lists for ADHD and autism. Sitting on a waiting list for 5 years, nothing equals nothing. No information, no guidance. How does that help anybody? So we're using screening to identify what that person's profile of strengths and challenges are and providing them practical guidance today. Now, if they meet a threshold, and that's an arbitrary threshold because it depends on demand and supply and demand, it is an arbitrary threshold because we're limiting who goes through the gates in some way. At least those people who have got symptoms that don't meet the threshold get something. And our present system doesn't allow that to happen. And it has to be ethically, morally wrong. So if we can give people things in society that can help and support them, strategies and support them now, then we've got room and space for the more complex individuals to be able to get more complex, higher level intervention they require. And I think that's where we've got to, and we're doing it, right? We're doing it today. So it's not like a mythical thing. We can actually do it. So I think that we've got to be bold and talk to each other. I think it's researchers and clinicians and social workers and teachers and GPs and psychiatrists and talking together. And I had a conversation with a group of researchers this evening earlier on exactly about that. So I think we can. I'm a enthusiast still, Blandine, that we can do this.
Oh, I am as well. I just don't know how. The reality of the services and the reality of how it works is so hard, which doesn't mean we shouldn't, and that doesn't mean we can't. It just seems to be a constant change of mentality and working as a team. I mean, yeah, it's not so much, it's more a comment than an answer or whatever. I am extremely enthusiastic, and I hope, you know, we can have a similar chat in 5 years time, 10 years time, that things will have changed. But I had someone approaching me to help for a diagnosis that, you know, a child is 5 years old, they're struggling and they want to go private. I know some people in the chat have put about private diagnosis and actually don't know where to send. You know, I know the ADHD services, even private, and I know the autism service, even private, and, you know, CAMS has got the different pathway where we are as well, where we live. And actually, if you don't know exactly what the struggle is, I don't know of many, neurodiversity private assessor, you know, someone you can just send them to there, and regardless of whether the issues should be more autism or more ADHD or more dyspraxia, and it's just, let's just do a neurological assessment and, you know, just assess your strengths and difficulties. I think for me, that would be the dream way, where we just send everybody, whether it's private or NHS or research or clinical. Yeah, and I know lots of people do it in lots of different areas and different, but the majority of services are very siloed into that, and you can only go that way, or that way. Well, hopefully this is the shift, though. You know, we're creating this shift that, yeah, in 5 years' time it'll be completely different, and we're creating more different ways of accessing things, maybe.
I've just posted, I've developed a profiler which looks across neurodevelopmental conditions. Yeah. I'm not promoting it, but I'm just showing you what's available in that sense, that looks at functionally across people's profiles and provides them with strengths and support for their challenges, not diagnostically led. Do you know what I mean? So I do think in 5 years' time, I hope in even 2 or 3 years' time, that there are increasing models where we go, we need to support Jimmy in Cardiff and Jackie in Newcastle and direct them to their local services and their local voluntary sector organisations, and they can be signposted live. And I think that has to be, because we haven't got enough professionals. So we have to have other methods of being able to deliver intervention in a more cost-effective way. 5-year waiting list that's not a waiting list, that's not a service. And that's the reality, isn't it, really?
Mm. Yeah. And the Do It profiler, sorry, I recommend it to anyone, the link that Mamada put in the chat, because all the parents I work with, I've sent them through this, because it gives exactly the whole concept that we're talking about today in terms of understanding the broader.
Yeah, it's not, you know, I'm not saying it's the best thing, I'm just saying it's an answer. You know, it's one of the answers to try and be more functional. I think in the end, we need to have professionals working together. Children fall through the gaps. We all know that transition points are terrible, you know, so moving from primary to secondary school, or if you're moving in care or out of care, or you're excluded. And I think we've got to be better at plugging these gaps in systems. It's a systems problem, I think, very much.
Yeah, there is an interesting question in the Q&A. It says, looking at clinical practice, how can practitioners be supported towards a more transdiagnostic approach? It seems many health and social care education professionals specialize in certain diagnostic labels. So I guess it's interesting to see what we as researchers think, how they can be supported and how they maybe can also drive that change. I don't know who'd like to answer this question.
I agree that there is a sort of an operational challenge, and it's one of the things that I guess we were all reflecting on things, you know, people working with an autism service and people working in an ADHD service and having a specialization in diagnosing a given condition. And I think there is interesting research kind of suggesting that a lot of the services do operate like that, and there are very few examples across the country of services that work in a more integrated way. So I think I don't necessarily have an answer, but I do think that if we want to see that change, we do need to think about that of professionals and practitioners who work in those services, and thinking about how can we operationally increase that capacity, and then how can we organize those services to function in this new space. Yeah.
I think it is happening. I think there are a number of neurodevelopment, you know, I look back 15 years ago, we wouldn't have seen neurodevelopmental clinics in the way that we're seeing, you know, even across services. That, you know, I think they're happening more. We've got a neurodevelopmental service across Wales where, you know, different clinics where they're starting to operate, not just in ADHD and ASD, but across other neurodevelopmental conditions as well. I think we need, there's, you know, it's the other people interfacing. GPs need training. It's the CAMS adult psychiatry interface where we need, you know, it's where people go often, or where they come from, is that we need more training in those areas to signpost people effectively. But I think the concept of neurodiversity maybe is a useful one to frame the discussion. It doesn't paint, it's not cleanly painting one type of person, is it? So it's allowing for discussion to say, okay, let's look at your profile, let's look at your strengths, your challenges. It allows for a different discussion and framing, and maybe that's the language is a useful one to start that off.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, if we think of diagnostic processes as a route for getting support, and currently I think having a diagnosis is quite often a requirement to getting adjustment at work, at school. And can we say that the requirement of having a formal diagnosis kind of blocks some neurodivergent people from getting personalized support they need? And what do you think we as researchers can do to explore possibilities of alternative routes to support in terms of, can we somehow create an environment, society where we, obviously not to disregard diagnosis because it can be really helpful for some people, but does it need to be the only way for getting support? And how else can we approach kind of support separately for diagnosis, and making sure that people get the support as quickly as they need and without any waiting times?
I think the starting point has to be thinking about universal design principles and taking those and thinking about increasing accessibility. So if we know that in society we've got, you know, I don't know, changes all the time, 15, 20%, we look at prevalence rates, I'm really not sure how we're measuring prevalence rates anymore. But if we're saying there is a percentage of society that doesn't fit in with education systems or employment systems, then we have to go, who's being left out, who's being excluded. So what can we do that is good inclusive practice? That starts with accessibility. You can't get an education healthcare plan unless you're literate. It's really difficult. You've got to fill in reams of forms, right? So we're excluding people who are coming from certain socioeconomic groups by our design. We're excluding them. You know, in employment, by design, if you can't talk well in an interview, you're not going to do very well because you're judged on your communication skills, even though it's got nothing to do with the job. So that if we go back to the money in the system, which is limited these days, the best bang for a buck is to be as inclusive as possible at the start, the design of our systems and processes. So in the workplace, to get adjustments, if you're doing right for most, that's going to be much cheaper than doing right for one person, another person, another person. So I do think using a universal design approach and inclusive practice will reach more people in education and the workplace. And then if they're not succeeding, then we've got capacity in health, we've got capacity in other places to help those people who are not succeeding despite those things being put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking at some more questions from the audience. And so, you know of much, I think it's the questions, do you know much transdiagnostic work in adult mental health? It feels like things get even more divided in the adult services. I don't know if that's comparison to children's services, but maybe it was a point. No, it was a point made after the presentation. So I think it's, yeah, it's, maybe let's skip to the next one. There is a question, how are you feeding this discussion to members of parliament who are debating ADHD, ASD diagnosis on 6th February? Yeah, that's a, I guess, interesting question, how to combine our work with the policy work. I don't know if anyone would like to answer.
I guess we, I can kind of speak about, we attempted to do this, and we organized a few months ago a workshop, including a lot of research, a lot of people with lived experience, as well as some kind of people from policy, attempting to kind of have this conversation over 2 days. And we had, we're in the process of kind of finalizing a policy brief on the topic. And we're also writing sort of a consensus statement, because what we did on the day was sort of identified some key priorities in the space of like research related to this. So I think these are some ways in which we have tried to engage in this conversation. I think I'm sure the others will also be able to give similar examples, but I think it's very important to include a lot of voices in that conversation, because I think both in our case, I think it was very important to have lived experience, research, stakeholders, practitioners feeding into the policy briefs, because I think we all have a very important voices to and insights to share. Yeah,
I'd agree. I think, you know, the consensus approach, when you bring together people from different parts, different experiences, and bring those voices together to present to government is terribly important, really is. It's not one strand, we need to have that. And that's where researchers can be, you know, highly effective at being able to do that effectively in a fair and fair way, and present that information in a way that can be understood by Parliament as well, so to have the most impact.
Yes, and I've done something very similar to Silvana. We are setting up an event. It will be in March. It won't be in time for the February deadline, but we have a stakeholder event, again, very similar, involving, you know, lived experience, the commissioners, the healthcare professionals, the researchers, and trying to get all these people to talk about that in terms of prioritizing neurodiversity services. So we're really trying, even though the project I'm working on is on ADHD and autism, we're trying to encompass all, you know, all of them with that. You know, it's not just about ADHD and autism. You know, there's lots of the neurodiversities that are not being commissioned or prioritized in terms of training and in terms of commissioning priorities and services, especially for the adults. So if we move back to the previous questions in terms of adult services, we know that, you know, for children, you have camps, and somehow there's people to cater for potentially everything within the label of camps. But when it comes to adults, then it all gets really, really messy and different. So yeah, we're doing a stakeholder policy event in order to get that going. But it's just very hard to get all the way to the top, you know, and whatever the top is. And from my experience of working with policy impact, is really much being there at the right time, you know, talking to the right person that seems to have an interest, and then we'll pick it up and we run with it. But trying to find these people, you know, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of trying. You email that person, you try to set up a meeting with this one and this one, and to get the one to just work with you on this. And there isn't a clear pathway to implementing change when it comes to this, I found. But again, I think we're in a very good place to do that, and it's yeah, it's very interesting to be able to start this shift. at the policy level.
And I think we have time for one more question, and I think there's one more quite important question. Someone is asking, where can I find help about getting a diagnosis? So I don't know if you know of any, but we can also just send them out later after the event. But I guess it's quite a complicated thing. And I think the person says, I suspect I have ASD. But I guess
depends where you are, depends what the waiting list is, depends whether you want to fund it or not, depends whether you want an autism in isolation diagnosis and not looking across neurodevelopmental co-occurrence, because if you have ADHD and you may want or need or may need or try or be to have medication, then getting a diagnosis of ADHD may not mean that your GP will continue to prescribe. That's a postcode lottery across the UK as well. So I think it's a quagmire at the moment. There are services where you can pay to get a diagnosis, but it doesn't always mean you're going to get intervention and support afterwards. So this is the problem we've got. So the label, some people want that, feel very pleased that they've got it, but it doesn't always mean that you get all the resources or support afterwards. So we're in a bit of a pickle at the moment, I think. We've got long waiting lists and there is inequity. Those who can afford it can pay for it. Those who can't will wait a long time. And it's not a great position at the moment. We've just been doing a report with ADHD. I'm chair of the ADHD Foundation, and we're just going to publish a report coming out and looking at the inequity in waiting list time across the UK and the variability in children and adult services. So there's a piece of published work looking at the inequity. So I'm sorry, it's a bit depressing, but that's why we need neurodevelopmental pathways and different ways of delivering it. Our system doesn't work as it is, really. I think that's the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today. But thank you so much for all your questions. They really allow us to dig deeper into what our speakers have been sharing and help us broaden the discussion. If you are interested in the work of Embracing Complexity, you can follow us on Twitter to stay up to date. And if speakers want to share any links as well, please send me them and I will send them to attendees. And all that's left for me to say is huge thank you to Amanda, Blandine, and Silvana for sharing their work with us today and for answering audience questions so thoughtfully. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us, and thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.